The briefing room in Baker Street was cold despite the coal fire burning in the grate. Winter had settled over London with particular viciousness that year, and even inside the nondescript building that housed the Special Operations Executive, men kept their greatcoats on. The walls were lined with maps of occupied Europe, marked with colored pins indicating resistance networks, drop zones, and target sites. Major Jeffrey Hartwell of the SOE studied a series of reconnaissance photographs spread across the table. The images had been taken by an RAF Mosquito flying at 15,000 feet over eastern France, near the German border. They showed a railway line running through the Vosges Mountains, a secondary route that had seen increased traffic over the past month. Intelligence analysis suggested the Germans were using this line to transport material that they wanted to keep away from Allied air reconnaissance, supplies too valuable or too sensitive for the main rail corridors that were regularly bombed. The intelligence came from multiple sources. French resistance networks had reported increased German security along the line, with Wehrmacht infantry units replacing the usual railway police. A Swiss businessman with connections to German industrial firms had passed information through neutral channels about specialized freight cars being manufactured in Mulhouse. Radio intercepts by Bletchley Park had identified references to a transport designated Geister Transport, Ghost Transport, scheduled to move through the region in late December. What the Ghost Transport carried remained uncertain, but the pattern of security and the timing suggested significance. The Battle of the Bulge had begun on December 16th, and the Germans were throwing everything available into the Ardennes offensive. Any transport heading toward the front lines during this period would be carrying critical supplies, ammunition, fuel, or weapons. The decision was made to insert a sabotage team. The mission would be designated Operation Phantom, appropriately named for targeting a ghost train. The team would parachute into the Vosges, link up with local resistance fighters, identify the exact route and timing of the transport, and destroy it. Captain James Sinclair was selected to lead the team. 31 years old, a professional soldier who had served in the Royal Engineers before volunteering for special operations, Sinclair had spent 18 months working with the French resistance. He spoke fluent French with a Norman accent, understood the rhythms of occupied territory, and possessed the technical knowledge to demolish railway infrastructure effectively. His face was unremarkable, the kind of face that could pass through checkpoints without attracting second glances. The team would consist of 6 men: Sinclair, 2 Royal Engineers sergeants trained in demolitions, 2 French liaison officers who had escaped to Britain after the fall of France, and a wireless operator from the Royal Corps Signals. Each man had been selected for specific skills and had operated behind enemy lines before. The failure rate for SOE operations was high, but these were survivors. Their equipment was carefully selected. Each man would carry a Sten Mark II submachine gun, chosen for its reliability and ease of concealment. Ammunition was limited, 3 magazines per man, 90 rounds total. The demolition sergeants would carry the primary explosives, 20 pounds of plastic explosive P808, detonators, time pencils, and primer cord. The wireless operator carried a B2 transceiver, the standard SOE radio, packed in a case disguised as a commercial traveler's sample bag. The French liaisons carried forged identity papers, ration cards, and work permits that would allow them to move through occupied territory. They would also carry something less conventional: 60 pounds of Nobel 808 explosive shaped into charges specifically designed for rail demolition. These charges, developed by SOE's technical section, could be clamped directly onto rail tracks and would cut through the steel with shape charge precision. The charges were painted rust brown to blend with railway infrastructure and could be armed with time pencils that provided delays ranging from 10 minutes to 24 hours. The drop was scheduled for December 21st, 3 days before Christmas. The weather forecast predicted cloud cover and moderate winds, acceptable conditions for a night parachute insertion. December 21st, 1944. The Vosges Mountains. The Halifax bomber crossed the French coast at 8,000 feet, flying without navigation lights through darkness broken only by scattered clouds and the faint glow of snow-covered ground. The six-man team sat in the fuselage, wearing padded jumpsuits over civilian clothing, parachutes strapped to their backs, and containers of equipment attached to their legs. The jump came at 0230 hours, over a clearing identified by resistance scouts as suitable for night drops. The dispatcher opened the door, cold air rushing in, and the men went out in quick succession. Sinclair felt the familiar shock of the parachute opening, then the quieter descent through darkness, trying to judge height and landing zone from the vague shapes of trees below. He landed in snow, rolled, and gathered his parachute. The others were down within 200 meters, visible as moving shadows in the darkness. They cached their parachutes and jumpsuits under a fallen tree, covering them with snow and branches. The equipment containers were located and broken open. Within 20 minutes of landing, the team was assembled, armed, and moving toward the prearranged rendezvous point. The resistance contact arrived an hour before dawn, a man in his 40s named Claude, wearing a farmer's wool coat and rubber boots. He led them to a barn 3 kilometers from the drop zone, where they would hide during daylight hours. The barn smelled of hay and cattle, and its loft provided adequate concealment and a view of the surrounding fields. Claude brought information. The Ghost transport was scheduled to pass through the region on December 23rd, traveling from Mulhouse towards Saarbrücken. The route followed the secondary line through the Vosges, avoiding the main junctions that were frequent targets of Allied bombing. The train would travel at night, moving slowly through mountain terrain, and would pass through a particular stretch of track that Claude's network had identified as vulnerable. The stretch was a curve following a steep hillside, where the track ran on an embankment 20 feet above a ravine. The location was remote, far from any village, with forest on both sides. German patrols were irregular, usually one Wehrmacht squad checking the line once per day, more frequently immediately before scheduled transports. Claude provided additional details gathered by the resistance. The transport would consist of approximately 20 freight cars pulled by a Kriegslokomotive 52, the standard German freight locomotive, a heavy, powerful machine designed for wartime production. The freight cars were covered, preventing visual identification of cargo, but the presence of guard cars suggested valuable content. Wehrmacht soldiers would be stationed in a car at the front and rear of the train, with additional guards possibly riding between cars. The plan developed from this intelligence. The team would mine the track at the curve, using timed charges that would detonate after the locomotive had passed, but while the freight cars were directly over the explosives. The explosion would derail the cars, sending them down the embankment into the ravine. The team would not engage the guards unless necessary. Their objective was destruction of cargo, not combat with superior forces. Timing was critical. The charges needed to detonate while the most valuable cars were over the detonation point. This required knowing the train's speed, the number of cars, and the spacing between them. It also required time pencils reliable enough to function in sub-zero temperatures. The SOE's technical section had developed cold weather time pencils, but their reliability was never absolute. December 22nd, 1944. Reconnaissance. The team moved to the target site the following night, traveling through forest trails known to the resistance. The temperature had dropped to 15 degrees Fahrenheit, and snow fell steadily, muffling sound but making movement more difficult. They carried minimal equipment, weapons, explosives, reconnaissance tools. The railway embankment appeared as a dark line cutting through white forest, elevated on a slope that rose sharply from the ravine below. The track was a standard gauge line, built before the war, with wooden ties and steel rails showing rust and wear. The curve was sharp enough to require reduced speed. Sinclair estimated trains would take it at 20 to 30 kilometers per hour. The team spent 4 hours conducting reconnaissance. They measured distances, identified firing positions, located escape routes through the forest. The ravine below the embankment was steep and filled with snow-covered boulders. Any freight cars derailed here would tumble 40 feet and be destroyed utterly. The demolition sergeants, Corporal Frank Morris and Corporal William Reed, examined the track structure. They identified 3 placement points for charges, spaced to maximize destructive effect across multiple cars. Each charge would consist of 3 pounds of Nobel 808 explosive clamped to the rail, positioned to sever the track and collapse the embankment simultaneously. The challenge was timing. Time pencils worked through a simple mechanism. Crushing a copper tube released acid that ate through a wire holding back a spring-loaded striker. When the wire dissolved, the striker hit a percussion cap that detonated the charge. The delay depended on the acid strength and wire thickness. In cold weather, the acid worked more slowly, making precise timing difficult. Morris and Reed calculated they would need a 15-minute delay from the moment of arming to detonation. This would give them time to arm all 3 charges, retreat to a safe distance, and allow for the train's arrival. If the train arrived early, the charges would detonate before the optimal cars were in position. If it arrived late, German guards might discover the charges during routine patrol. They also prepared a backup detonation method, a pull-wire igniter connected to one of the charges, hidden in the forest 50 meters from the track. If the time pencils failed or timing went wrong, someone could manually detonate the charges by pulling the wire. December 23, 1944. Execution. The team was in position by 2,100 hours. Claude had sent word that the ghost transport had departed Mulhouse at 1,800 hours and was running on schedule. Estimated arrival at the target site, 2,230 hours. Sinclair positioned his men in a defensive perimeter. The 2 French liaisons watching the forest approaches from east and west, the wireless operator in a concealed position with the radio ready for emergency transmission, himself watching the track from the south. Morris and Reed moved to the embankment with the charges. The cold was brutal. Men stamped their feet quietly to maintain circulation, flexed fingers inside wool gloves. The forest was silent except for the occasional crack of a freezing branch. Snow continued to fall, light flakes that accumulated on equipment and clothing. Morris and Reed worked quickly but carefully. Each charge was clamped to the inside of the rail, secured with wire, then camouflaged with snow and dirt. The time pencils were inserted, glass tubes containing copper ampoules of acid. Crushing the copper with pliers released the acid. Morris crushed each pencil at 2,215 hours, giving exactly 15 minutes before detonation. They retreated from the embankment and took positions in the forest. The pull wire was laid, connected, tested. The forest settled back into silence. At 2,225 hours, they heard the train. The sound came first as a low vibration felt through the ground, then as the rhythmic chug of a steam locomotive laboring through mountain terrain. The locomotive's headlight appeared around a curve a kilometer to the south, a yellow beam cutting through snow and darkness. Sinclair watched through binoculars. The locomotive was indeed a Kriegslokomotive 52, a massive black machine with a squared-off boiler and a forward-mounted headlight. Behind it came the freight cars, dark boxes on wheels, their canvas covers dusted with snow. He counted 5 cars, 10 cars, 15, 18 total. The train moved slowly, conserving steam for the gradient. Speed was approximately 25 kilometers per hour. The engineer would be watching the track ahead, alert for obstacles or signals. The locomotive passed the detonation point at 2,228 hours. The freight cars followed, wheels clicking over rail joints, the sound echoing off the ravine walls. Sinclair counted cars. 1, 2, 3, 4. At 2,230 hours, exactly 15 minutes after Morris had crushed the time pencils, nothing happened. Sinclair felt his chest tighten. The charges had failed, or the cold had slowed the acid, or the calculations were wrong. The train continued rolling past, car after car. In 30 seconds, it would be completely past the detonation zone. He looked at Morris, who was already reaching for the pull wire. Morris yanked hard. The explosion was immediate and massive. 3 charges detonated simultaneously, tearing through rails and embankment with a roar that echoed across the valley. A section of track 40 feet long disintegrated, rails twisting upward, wooden ties shattering, earth collapsing. The 7th freight car was directly over the explosion. Its front wheels dropped into the gap, tipping forward. The car behind it crashed into its rear, buckling, derailing. The cascade continued, car after car piling into the wreckage, some sliding sideways off the embankment, some flipping entirely, tumbling down into the ravine with crashes that shook the ground. The locomotive, already past the explosion, continued forward for another 100 meters before the engineer could apply brakes. The first 6 cars, still coupled to the locomotive, remained on the rails. The rear 12 cars were destroyed. Machine gun fire erupted from the guard cars, Wehrmacht soldiers firing blindly into the forest, muzzle flashes bright in the darkness. Tracer rounds arced through trees, cutting branches, kicking up snow. Sinclair gave a retreat signal. The team moved back through the forest in pairs, using pre-planned routes, heading for the secondary rendezvous point 3 kilometers north. Behind them, the sounds of the derailment continued. Steam hissing from ruptured pipes, men shouting in German, the crack of ammunition cooking off in burning freight cars. They reached the rendezvous at 100 hours. All 6 men accounted for. No casualties. Claude was waiting with 2 other resistance fighters and a farm truck. The team loaded quickly, covering themselves with hay and canvas. The truck drove north, away from the railway, onto back roads that wound through villages where German presence was minimal. December 24th, 1944. Aftermath. The wireless operator established contact with London at 400 hours from a safe house 15 kilometers from the derailment site. The message was brief, encoded. Phantom successful stop train derailed, stop minimum 12 cars destroyed, stop team intact, stop. Claude brought news later that morning. German troops had cordoned off the derailment site, but local people had seen the wreckage. Freight cars scattered down the ravine, some burning, others split open with their contents visible. The cargo had been mixed: artillery shells and wooden crates, fuel drums, and most significantly, several cars carrying what appear to be rocket components, long cylindrical sections marked with Piemont factory codes. The rocket components confirmed the intelligence value of the target. Piemont was the German research facility that developed the V-1 flying bomb and V-2 rocket. Any transport carrying components from that facility represented cutting-edge weapons technology being moved to launch sites or assembly facilities. The destruction of 12 freight cars carrying such material would not change the outcome of the war, but would delay German rocket operations and deny resources to the Ardennes offensive. Every shell not delivered, every gallon of fuel destroyed, every rocket component scattered across a ravine represented a marginal degradation of German capability. The team remained in the Vosges for 3 more days, moving between safe houses while the Germans conducted sweeps of the area. Wehrmacht units searched villages, questioned civilians, arrested suspected resistance members. The net tightened, but Claude's network had operated for years and knew how to hide. On December 27th, the team was extracted. They traveled west in a convoy of farm vehicles, posing as agricultural workers being transported to labor assignments. At the Swiss border, forged documents provided by the resistance network allowed them to cross in a neutral territory. From Switzerland, they traveled to Spain, then Gibraltar, finally reaching Britain by military transport on January 4th, 1945. London, January 1945. The debriefing took place in the same Baker Street room where the operation had been planned. Major Hartwell reviewed the mission report, photographs taken by resistance fighters of the derailment site, and intelligence assessments of the cargo. Operation Phantom was classified as a success. The team had achieved its primary objective, destruction of the ghost transport, with no casualties and minimal compromise of resistance networks. The intelligence gained about German rocket component shipments had been forwarded to Allied air forces, which increased bombing of suspected V-weapon sites. Captain Sinclair was promoted to major and awarded the Distinguished Service Order. The other team members received commendations. The French liaison officers returned to France with new assignments coordinating between the advancing Allied armies and resistance forces. But the real measure of success was quieter and more difficult to quantify. Somewhere in the Ardennes, a German artillery battery had fewer shells to fire. Somewhere in the Netherlands, A V-2 launch site waited for components that never arrived. Somewhere in the Wehrmacht logistics chain, officers struggled to explain the loss of a train that officially did not exist. The ghost transport had been carrying ghosts indeed. The ghosts of German technological superiority, the ghosts of weapons that might have prolonged the war, the ghosts of soldiers who might have died from those weapons. In destroying it, Operation Phantom had made those ghosts a little more real, a little more final. Epilogue. The ghost train operation remained classified for 30 years after the war. When documents were finally released in 1975, historians noted it as one of numerous successful SOE sabotage operations that cumulatively degraded German logistics and morale. The exact contents of the freight cars were never fully cataloged. German records for the transport were destroyed or lost in the chaos of the war's final months. French record from the resistance mentioned rocket components, artillery ammunition, and fuel drums. Eyewitness accounts varied. What remained certain was the physical evidence. A section of railway embankment in the Vosges Mountains where the track had been repaired after the war, the repair work visible in the different color of the rail metal and the newer wooden ties. The ravine below still contained fragments of steel and wood, rusted and overgrown, but recognizable to anyone who knew what to look for. Captain James Sinclair, later Major Sinclair, remained in the Army after the war, serving in various postings until his retirement in 1965. He never spoke publicly about Operation Phantom, adhering to the Official Secrets Act until his death in 1982. His obituary mentioned his wartime service but provided no details. The 6 men who had parachuted into the Vosges on that December night had performed a mission that was simultaneously dramatic and mundane. Dramatic in its execution, mundane in its place within the larger machinery of total war. They had been neither heroes nor victims, simply professionals doing difficult work under dangerous conditions, achieving a specific objective with available resources. The ghost transport had rolled through the darkness, carrying weapons meant to kill Allied soldiers. It had been destroyed by Allied soldiers carrying weapons meant to destroy trains. The exchange was symmetrical, impersonal, and ultimately meaningless except to the individuals involved and those who might have died from the weapons that never arrived. The ghosts of that December night remained. The ghost of a train, the ghosts of men who might have died, the ghosts of outcomes that never occurred. They haunted no one because they had been prevented from ever existing at all. In the calculus of war, that was counted as success.